Story number 1. The Forgotten Pump. Driving through the vast, sun-scorched expanse of Arizona has always been a solitary pleasure for me. The endless highways, flanked by rugged desert landscapes and towering saguaro cacti, offer a sense of freedom that's hard to find elsewhere. In the summer of 2012, I was on a routine cross-country haul, navigating the Interstate 40 corridor from Los Angeles to Chicago. It was supposed to be just another long haul, but one stop at a seemingly ordinary gas station would change everything I knew about the road. The day had been grueling, hours behind the wheel, the hum of the engine my only companion, and the relentless sun beating down through the windshield. By late afternoon, my fuel gauge was creeping dangerously low. I glanced at the map on my phone. Only about 50 miles to go before the next major town. But a glance in the rearview mirror showed the sun beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the asphalt. I decided to make a quick detour to a small, nondescript gas station that popped up almost magically on my GPS, Gas & Go, a name that didn't inspire much confidence. As I approached, the station appeared even smaller than it had on the map, nestled between a dry riverbed and a line of sparse, thorny bushes. The windows were dusty, and the neon sign buzzed faintly, flickering intermittently. I pulled into the pump, relieved to see a lone attendant standing behind the counter. He was an older man, his skin weathered from years under the harsh desert sun. His eyes, though tired, held a strange intensity that made me uneasy. "Evening," I greeted, pulling out my wallet. "Just need to top off the tank." He nodded silently, his gaze never wavering from mine. I began fueling, the sound of the gasoline filling the brief silence between us. The station was eerily quiet, the only other sound being the distant call of a nightjar somewhere in the desert. As the tank filled, I glanced around the small store area. It was cluttered with old magazines, a few dusty snacks, and a faded map of Arizona with no current roads marked. I was about to pay when something caught my eye. A crumpled receipt lying on the counter. Curious, I picked it up, unfolding it to reveal details that sent a chill down my spine. The date on the receipt was dated June 15th, 1987. It listed items and services that mirrored my own recent stops: fuel, a bottle of water, and a quick snack. But how could that be? It was 25 years before my trip. My confusion deepened as I noticed a signature at the bottom. A name I didn't recognize, Eleanor B. "Do you recognize this?" I asked, holding up the receipt. The attendant looked at it, then at me, his expression unreadable. "Eleanor?" he echoed, his voice flat. "I haven't seen that name in decades." I frowned, the unease growing. "I'm sure I just got this," I said, trying to shake off the strange feeling. "Must have fallen out of my wallet somewhere." He nodded slowly, returning his gaze to the dusty shelves behind him. "Sometimes things find their way back," he murmured cryptically. Before I could respond, a sudden gust of wind swept through the open windows, rustling the papers and causing the old sign above the counter to sway. The attendant didn't flinch, but I couldn't help but feel like there was something he wasn't telling me. I paid for the fuel, my hands slightly trembling as I handed over my card. As I turned to leave, I glanced back one last time, noticing the attendant staring intently at me, his eyes dark and shadowed. The drive away from Gas & Go was uneventful at first. The radio played soft country tunes, and the desert night embraced me with its cool, quiet darkness. But as I continued, the unease from the gas station lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I kept replaying the receipt in my head, the incongruity of the date making my skin crawl. About 10 miles down the road, my GPS flickered and reset, rerouting me onto a gravel path that led deeper into the desert. I glanced at the screen, hoping it was just a glitch, but the new route made little sense. The main highway was behind me, and the path ahead seemed to disappear into the darkness. I decided to follow the new directions, thinking it might lead me to a more populated area. The gravel crunched under my tires, and the headlights of my truck cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but endless sand and the occasional distant mountain silhouette. As I drove, the sky overhead was a tapestry of stars, more vivid and numerous than I'd ever seen. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow on the desert floor. The air was still, the only sounds the gentle hum of the engine and the occasional call of a night creature. About halfway through the gravel path, the road ended abruptly, and I found myself in a barren clearing. In the center stood an old, abandoned gas station, eerily similar to Gas and Go, but far more dilapidated. The building was crumbling, the paint peeling off in large chunks, and the windows were shattered, revealing the decayed interior. A rusted pump stood nearby, long since out of order. Confusion and fear welled up inside me. How could this gas station resemble Gas and Go yet be so different? My heart pounded as I realized I might be caught in some sort of supernatural loop or illusion. The stars above seemed to pulse, and a chill wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it whispers that I couldn't quite make out. I reached for the steering wheel, contemplating turning back, but something compelled me to get out of the truck and explore. As I approached the decrepit building, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, forming fragmented phrases that sent shivers down my spine. "Help us," one voice seemed to say. "Don't leave us." I froze, my breath visible in the cold night air. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is anyone here?" No response, just the sound of the wind and the haunting whispers. I stepped closer, peering through a broken window, and saw shadows moving within the darkness, figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. My pulse quickened as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the full moon cast an otherworldly glow on the scene. The gas station felt alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy that pressed in on me from all sides. I backed away, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. I stumbled back to my truck, fumbling with the door handle. As I opened it, a gust of icy wind slammed the door shut behind me, trapping me inside. The interior of the truck seemed to distort, the reflections in the mirrors warping into twisted versions of reality. The dashboard clock flickered, showing the time from the receipt, June 15th, 1987. I stared at it in horror, my mind racing. How was this possible? How was I experiencing events from 25 years in the past? Panic surged through me as the whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling the cabin with their ghostly chorus. The steering wheel felt heavy in my hands as I tried to start the engine, but it refused to budge. The fuel gauge dipped dangerously low, mirroring the situation from my earlier stop at Gas and Go. The realization hit me hard. Something was forcing me to relive this haunting experience, to remain trapped in a loop of time and terror. I reached down to check the fuel level, and my eyes met the receipt once more, lying on the passenger seat. The date, the name, everything was the same. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her, the woman in white from Gas and Go, standing just outside the truck, her eyes hollow and sorrowful. "You shouldn't have stayed," she whispered, her voice echoing inside the cabin. "Now you belong to us." I tried to shut the door, to block out her presence, but it was futile. The whispers intensified, turning into agonized cries that reverberated through the truck. The air grew thick with a suffocating dread, and I felt an invisible force pulling me toward the window, toward her. In a final, desperate attempt to break free, I slammed my fist against the dashboard, sending the receipt flying into the air. The woman in white faded, her presence dissolving into the night as the truck's interior began to shift back to its present state. The clock on the dashboard resumed ticking, and the engine roared to life once more. I didn't hesitate. I floored the accelerator, racing down the gravel path as fast as my truck would go. The road stretched endlessly before me, the night reclaiming its silence as I left the haunted gas station behind. The eerie experience left me shaken, the memory of the whispers and the woman in white etched into my mind like a permanent scar. When I finally reached a populated area the next morning, I stopped at a modern gas station to refuel. The contrast between the two stations stark and unsettling. The attendant there was friendly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows of the desert. I called the number on the receipt, hoping to find some answers, but the line was dead, no response. No signal. Nothing. I realized that the receipt must have been a relic from the past, somehow intertwined with my own experience in a way that defied explanation. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't forget what happened that night. I delved into local legends and ghost stories, trying to find a connection between Gas and Go and the abandoned station I had encountered. What I discovered was chilling. There had been a tragic accident on that very stretch of road in 1987. A young woman named Eleanor Brooks had lost her life in a car crash, her car flipping over the steep incline of the pass. The gas station had been abandoned shortly after, its existence fading into obscurity, a forgotten relic of a sorrowful past. People said that on certain nights, the ghost of Eleanor would appear, her spirit forever bound to the road, seeking solace and company in the dead of night. The whispers and the apparitions were believed to be her way of reaching out, trapped in a loop of her last moments. Understanding the legend didn't make it any less terrifying. I realized that I had become a part of her story, a new chapter in a tale of sorrow and entrapment. The encounter was a stark reminder of the thin veil between our world and the restless spirits that linger in forgotten places, waiting for a connection, a story left untold. Years have passed since that haunting night in Arizona, but the memory remains vivid, a ghostly echo that follows me down every lonely highway. I've heard other stories from fellow truckers, accounts of phantom vehicles, ghostly figures on desolate roads, and inexplicable occurrences that defy logic. Each story adds another layer to the folklore of the highways, a testament to the enduring mystery of the road and the souls that wander it. I never drive through that stretch of highway again, steering clear of the remote passes and the stories that whisper through the desert winds. But sometimes, late at night, when the road is empty and the stars blanket the sky, I catch a glimpse of a shadow in my rearview mirror, a silent reminder of the night when time stood still and the past reached out to claim a new victim. If you ever find yourself driving alone on a deserted road in Arizona, and you see a figure standing by the roadside, dressed in white and staring intently at your truck, heed my warning. Don't stop. Don't look back, because some spirits aren't ready to let go, and some roads are paved with the echoes of the past, waiting to trap you in their eternal, haunting journey. Remember my story, and let it serve as a cautionary tale. The desert is beautiful, but it's also a place where the forgotten linger, their stories intertwined with the very roads that lead them nowhere. Story number 2. The man crossing the road. Driving through the Appalachian Mountains has always been a solace for me. The winding roads, blanketed in autumn's fiery hues, offer a temporary escape from the chaos of everyday life. In the fall of 2005, I decided to take a solo trip, hauling freight from Pittsburgh to Asheville. It was supposed to be a straightforward job, but what I encountered on that secluded mountain road would haunt me forever. The journey started like any other. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the undulating landscape. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. My rig, a sturdy Kenworth, hummed steadily as I navigated the narrow, winding roads that cut through the heart of Appalachia. The radio played classic rock, a comforting background to the rhythmic thump of the tires on the asphalt. By late afternoon, I found myself on a particularly remote stretch of highway known as Devil's Backbone. Locals warned me about this road, how it twisted and turned unpredictably, with steep drop-offs and barely any guardrails. But I was a seasoned driver, accustomed to the challenges of mountain roads. I didn't think much of it, focusing instead on the task at hand. As twilight deepened into night, the sky transformed into a canvas of deep indigos and blacks. pierced only by the occasional star struggling to shine through the canopy of trees. The road ahead was dark, illuminated solely by my headlights cutting through the darkness. The silence was profound, broken only by the hum of the engine and the distant call of an owl. It was around midnight when I first saw him, a solitary figure dressed entirely in white, standing on the road just ahead. At first glance, he seemed out of place, his attire contrasting sharply against the dark asphalt and the dense forest flanking the highway. I slowed down, curiosity piqued by the unexpected sight. As I approached, the figure remained motionless, staring straight ahead. The full moon cast a ghostly glow on his face, obscuring any discernible features. His presence was unsettling, an eerie calm that sent a shiver down my spine. I debated whether to stop, but something in his stillness urged me to continue driving. Minutes passed, and the man remained at the edge of the road, unmoving. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him watching me from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the empty expanse of the road and the dense forest beyond. I resumed driving, but the image of the man lingered in my mind, a haunting presence that I couldn't shake. The road seemed narrower now, the trees looming closer, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out into the night. The silence pressed in, thick and oppressive, making every sound amplify my own breathing, the ticking of the dashboard clock, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. About 10 minutes later, as I rounded a particularly sharp bend, I saw him again, a fleeting shadow crossing the road directly in front of my truck. My heart raced as I slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to an abrupt halt. I stared into the darkness, expecting to see him standing there once more. But there was no one. The road was empty, the trees undisturbed, and the snow on the ground remained untouched by footprints. Confusion and fear gripped me. I stepped out of the truck, the cold night air biting at my skin, and approached the edge of the road to inspect. The area around my truck was pristine, no tire marks, no sign of an accident, nothing to explain the sudden appearance of the man in white. "Hello," I called out, my voice wavering in the stillness. The only response was the howling wind and the distant hoot of an owl. I returned to my cab, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by the isolation and the cold. But the memory of his silent, unwavering gaze kept me from dismissing it entirely. As the night wore on, the unease only grew. The road seemed to stretch on forever, each mile blending into the next with no end in sight. I tried to focus on the rhythm of the road, the steady hum of the engine, but my mind kept drifting back to the man in white. Who was he? Why was he there? I glanced at the clock. It was now 12:47 a.m., 20 minutes past the hour when I first saw him. My eyes flicked to the dashboard clock, noticing something odd. It had stopped ticking, the second hand frozen at 12. Confusion turned to dread as I realized time itself seemed to have stalled. I reached over to reset the clock, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I tried to start the engine again. But the truck remained silent. I was stuck, alone on a deserted mountain road, with a stopped clock and a lingering presence that I couldn't comprehend. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as I sat there, the darkness pressing in around me. I considered calling for help, but my phone had no signal, a dead zone in this remote part of the mountain. Desperation clawed at me as I realized I was trapped in a moment that refused to move forward, a nightmare that wouldn't let me wake up. Then, the silence was shattered by a distant, eerie laughter, a soft, childlike giggle that seemed to echo from the very trees around me. I froze, my blood running cold as the sound repeated, growing louder and more insistent. The laughter seemed to come from all directions, surrounding me, filling the truck with an unsettling presence. I swung the door open, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the road remained empty. The laughter faded into a haunting melody that tugged at the edges of my sanity, pulling me deeper into fear. Desperate to escape, I fumbled with the door, trying to start the engine one last time. The truck finally roared to life, and I sped down the highway, the road ahead twisting and turning through the darkness. The feeling of being watched intensified, the laughter now a constant whisper in my ears, urging me to look back. I dared a glance in the rearview mirror, and there he was, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the road, watching me drive away. His eyes were hollow, his presence both menacing and sorrowful. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the road, but the feeling of his gaze followed me, a chilling reminder of the encounter. As I drove on, the clock began to tick again, each second a sharp reminder of my reality. The road eventually opened up into a more familiar stretch, the dense forest giving way to clearer skies and distant city lights. The unease lingered, a ghostly presence that clung to me like a second skin. When I finally arrived in Asheville, the city lights felt like a lifeline, a return to sanity after the harrowing experience in the mountains. I checked my phone, relieved to find it fully functional, and contacted my dispatcher to report the delay. My mind raced with questions. Who was that man in white? Why did time stop? And why did he follow me? I tried to talk it out with my friends, recounting the events of that night, but their reactions were mixed. Some dismissed it as a hallucination. Others whispered about ghostly apparitions that haunted the mountain roads. Regardless of their explanations, the memory remained vivid, permanent scar etched into my mind. Years have passed since that night in the Appalachian Mountains, but the experience still haunts me. I've heard similar stories from other drivers, tales of ghostly figures appearing on deserted roads, of time standing still in the dead of night, and of relentless laughter that echoes through the darkness. Some say it's the spirit of a lost traveler, forever wandering the mountain pass, while others believe it's something older, something that feeds on fear and isolation. I've avoided that stretch of highway ever since, steering clear of the Devil's Backbone and its ominous reputation. But sometimes, late at night, when the road stretches out before me and the darkness presses in, I catch a glimpse of a shadow in my rearview mirror, a silent, unwavering presence that reminds me of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. If you ever find yourself driving alone on a deserted mountain road, and you see a figure standing at the edge of the road, dressed in white and watching you drive by, heed my warning. Don't stop. Don't look back. Because some spirits aren't content to linger in the shadows. They're waiting to follow you into the darkness, to pull you into their eternal, haunting night. Remember my story, and let it serve as a cautionary tale. The mountains are beautiful, but they hold secrets that are better left undisturbed. Shadows that watch and wait, ready to claim their next unsuspecting traveler. Story number 3. The clock that stopped. Driving through the vast, unforgiving expanse of Alaska has always been both a test and a sanctuary for me. As a long-haul trucker, the open road is my constant companion, a place where the chaos of everyday life fades into the endless horizon of snow-covered plains and towering mountain ranges. In the summer of 1997, I embarked on what was supposed to be a routine trip from Anchorage to Fairbanks, hauling a load of construction materials that would help build the infrastructure for a new mining operation. The first few days were uneventful, just the way I liked it. The roads were clear, the weather predictable, and the solitude of the Alaskan wilderness provided a peaceful backdrop to my thoughts. My rig, a dependable Peterbilt, hummed steadily beneath me as I navigated the winding highways, the miles stretching endlessly before me. On the 5th day, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the frozen landscape, I entered a particularly remote stretch of highway known as the Dalton Pass. This part of Alaska was infamous for its isolation, where the road carved a narrow path through dense forests and rugged terrain. With no gas stations or motels for miles, it was a place where time seemed to stand still, and the only sounds were the crunch of my tires on the icy pavement and the occasional call of a distant eagle. As night fell, the temperature plummeted, and a biting wind began to howl through the pass, whipping the snow into fierce drifts that obscured the road ahead. My headlights barely pierced the darkness, illuminating nothing beyond a few feet in front of me. The isolation, which had once been a source of comfort, now felt oppressive, the silence stretching out like a vast, empty void. It was around 1:30 a.m. when I first noticed something odd. My dashboard clock, a reliable companion that had never failed me before, had stopped ticking. The minute hand was frozen at 1:30, and the seconds had come to a complete halt. I glanced at the odometer. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I shrugged it off, attributing it to a faulty gauge or a power surge from the harsh conditions outside. I continued driving, the eerie stillness of the night pressing in on me. For the next hour, everything seemed to hold its breath. No other vehicles passed by. No distant lights flickered on the horizon, and the world outside my window remained an unchanging expanse of white. The clock remained motionless, a silent sentinel in the midst of the frozen night. Then, without warning, the silence was shattered by a loud, metallic clang that echoed through the cabin of my truck. Startled, I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding as I brought the rig to a sudden halt. The sound had come from the front of the truck, as if something had hit the radiator or the bumper with tremendous force. I sat there, eyes wide, listening intently, but all I could hear was the howling wind outside and the steady, unbroken silence that had enveloped me for the past hour. I reached out to check the engine, my hands trembling slightly as I opened the hood. Everything looked normal, no obvious damage, no signs of an impact. I closed the hood and tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Maybe it was just a freak accident, a stray branch blown by the wind, but something felt off, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. As I sat back in my seat, trying to regain my composure, I glanced at the clock again. It was still stuck at 1:30, refusing to move forward. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that not only had the clock stopped, but the world around me seemed to have paused as well. Time itself had come to a standstill, leaving me trapped in a moment that felt both timeless and unnervingly static. I reached for my phone, intending to call for assistance, but it was dead, completely unresponsive. Panic began to rise in my chest as I realized the gravity of the situation. I was alone in one of the most remote parts of Alaska, with a stopped clock, a silent world, and no way to reach out for help. The realization that something beyond my understanding was at play began to take hold, a cold fear settling in the pit of my stomach. Desperate to make sense of what was happening, I decided to step out of the truck and take a closer look at my surroundings. Bundling up in my heavy jacket and gloves, I trudged through the deep snow toward the side of the road, flashlight in hand. The cold was biting, numbing my fingers and face, but I pushed forward, driven by a need to find answers. As I reached the edge of the truck, the landscape around me seemed to blur, the snow-covered trees standing motionless as if frozen in time. The wind howled louder now, a mournful wail that echoed through the empty pass. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through the blackness, revealing nothing but endless snow and shadowy outlines of trees that seemed to reach out toward me. Then, amidst the silence, I heard it, a faint, distant whisper that seemed to come from all around me. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. The whispers were unintelligible, a jumble of fragmented words and sorrowful sighs that sent chills racing down my spine. It was as if the very air around me was alive with the voices of the forgotten, trapped in a liminal space between worlds. I turned to head back to my truck, but the snow beneath my feet had transformed into a thick, swirling mist that obscured my vision. Panic surged through me as I realized that I couldn't see the road behind me, that the world had become an indistinguishable haze of white and shadow. The whispers continued, growing louder, more frantic, surrounding me in a cacophony of sorrow and despair. In the midst of the confusion, I saw a figure emerge from the mist, a translucent, ghostly apparition of a man dressed in old-fashioned hunting gear. His eyes were hollow, devoid of any warmth or recognition, and his mouth was twisted into a silent scream. He reached out a hand toward me, his expression one of eternal anguish. I stumbled backward, my legs weak and unsteady, as the apparition began to fade into the mist, the whispers intensifying into a deafening roar. I fell to my knees, the cold seeping into my bones, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I struggled to comprehend what was happening. Time itself seemed to mock me, the stopped clock serving as a constant reminder of my entrapment in this surreal nightmare. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I dragged myself back to the truck, the whispers now a relentless assault on my senses. I fumbled with the keys, desperately trying to start the engine, but it remained silent, the dashboard clock still immobile at 1:30. The realization that I was truly alone, yet surrounded by the echoes of the past, crushed me, the weight of the unseen presence pressing down on me like an invisible force. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, I began to drive again, the truck moving sluggishly through the thickening mist. The road ahead was an endless void, the landscape blending into a monochromatic blur that offered no guidance, no sense of direction. The whispers followed me, now interwoven with the howling wind, creating a haunting melody that played on an infinite loop. Hours passed, or was it minutes? As I drove through the unending night, the truck's engine a futile attempt to break free from the grasp of time itself. The sun never rose, the darkness eternal. As I became lost in a labyrinth of frozen moments and spectral echoes, the stopped clock was the only anchor to reality, its relentless stasis a cruel reminder of my entrapment. It wasn't until what felt like an eternity had passed that the first hints of dawn began to pierce the darkness. The sky tinged with the faintest hues of pink and orange. The whispers faded. The mist began to clear, and the world around me slowly returned to its natural rhythm. The clock finally began to move again, its hands ticking forward as if waking from a long slumber. I drove the rest of the way home in a daze, the experience etched into my mind like a scar that refused to fade. When I finally arrived back in Anchorage, the sun was fully risen, casting a warm glow over the city that felt like a stark contrast to the cold, haunting darkness I had endured in the wilderness. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to make sense of what had happened. Friends and family dismissed it as a vivid hallucination, a product of isolation and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had glimpsed something beyond the veil of reality, something that defied explanation and bound me to the frozen heart of Alaska's wilderness. To this day, I avoid that stretch of highway, the memories of that night a constant reminder of the thin line between the living and the dead. The stopped clock serves as a symbol of the moment when time itself chose to stand still, trapping me in a loop of fear and uncertainty that I can never fully escape. If you ever find yourself driving through the remote stretches of Alaska, and you feel the world around you begin to freeze, remember my story, keep moving forward, and don't let the whispers of the past pull you into their eternal embrace, because some moments are meant to remain frozen in time, and some roads lead to places where time itself refuses to move forward. Story number 4. Whispers in the Desert. Driving through the vast expanse of the Nevada desert has always been both exhilarating and humbling. The endless horizon, where the sky meets the barren landscape, offers a sense of freedom that's hard to find elsewhere. In the summer of 2005, I decided to take a solo trip, hauling freight from Las Vegas to Los Angeles. It was a routine job, one that I had done countless times, but nothing could have prepared me for the night that would forever change my perception of the desert. The journey had been uneventful for the most part. The sun had set a few hours earlier, leaving behind a blanket of darkness punctuated only by the distant glow of city lights. The temperature had dropped significantly, the air crisp and still. My rig was loaded with electronics, the hum of the engine a constant companion as I navigated the lonely highways that cut through the heart of Nevada. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I first noticed the faint sound, a soft, melodic laughter that seemed to be coming from the back seat of my truck. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of my tired mind, the result of long hours on the road and the isolation that comes with it. But the laughter persisted, growing slightly louder, more distinct, yet still impossibly distant. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see another driver or perhaps an animal disturbing the tranquility of the night. But there was nothing, just the empty expanse of the desert stretching out behind me. My heart began to race as the laughter continued, now accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps tapping rhythmically on the cab's metal floor. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice wavering despite my attempts to sound steady. The laughter ceased abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. I sat up, peering into the darkness of the back seat, my mind struggling to rationalize what I was experiencing. I decided to investigate, pulling over to the side of the highway. The headlights of my truck cut through the night, illuminating the area around me with harsh, unforgiving light. I reached out to check the back door, expecting to find it ajar or perhaps slightly open. To my horror, the door was locked tightly, every bit as secure as it had been before. Confusion and fear gnawed at me as I tried to comprehend the situation. How could I hear laughter and footsteps from a back seat that was firmly locked? I stepped out of the truck, the cold night air biting at my skin, and walked around to inspect the exterior. The back door was indeed locked, the latch clicking into place as I pressed it firmly. There were no signs of forced entry, no scratches or dents that suggested someone had tampered with it. Desperate for answers, I opened the back window, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever or whatever was causing the disturbance. The darkness beyond the glass was impenetrable, the desert night swallowing any faint light that dared to escape the confines of my truck. I could see my own reflection staring back at me, eyes wide with fear, but there was no one else in sight. "Okay, this is messed up," I muttered to myself, shutting the window and taking a deep breath. I decided to continue my journey, but the memory of those unexplained sounds lingered, casting a shadow over the rest of my drive. As I resumed driving, the sense of unease remained, the desert's vastness amplifying every creak and groan of the truck. The highway seemed to stretch on endlessly, the only signs of life the occasional distant city lights and the ever-present darkness that enveloped everything else. I tried to focus on the road, the rhythm of my driving, but my mind kept drifting back to the mysterious laughter and footsteps. About 30 minutes later, as I approached a particularly desolate stretch of road known as Dead Man's Pass, the strange occurrences began again. The laughter returned, louder this time, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of small feet pattering against the truck's floor. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, knuckles whitening as I fought to maintain control. I glanced in the mirror once more, heart pounding, but there was still no sign of anyone. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I pulled over again, my truck's engine idling as I stepped out into the chilly night. The area around Dead Man's Pass was notorious for its isolation, the road flanked by nothing but thick desert scrub and rocky outcrops. I approached the back of the truck cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I reached for the latch to inspect the back seat more thoroughly, I noticed something peculiar, a series of small, childlike footprints leading away from the truck and disappearing into the underbrush. The prints were fresh, the edges clear against the untouched snow that blanketed the ground. My blood ran cold as I followed the trail with my flashlight, the beam dancing over the rocky terrain. The footprints led me deeper into the wilderness, away from the safety of my truck and into the unknown. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but an inexplicable force compelled me to follow. The laughter resumed, now coming from all around me, echoing through the trees and bouncing off the rocky cliffs. The footsteps were everywhere, surrounding me, closing in. Panic surged through me as I realized I was not alone. Something was here, something that shouldn't be. I stumbled through the dense brush, the cold night air stinging my eyes and making it difficult to see. The sounds intensified, the laughter twisted into a haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. The shadows around me seemed to move, shifting and writhing as if alive. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged, a woman in a flowing white dress, her face obscured by long, dark hair that fell in tangled waves over her shoulders. Her eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to pierce through me, and her mouth was twisted into a silent scream. She raised her hand, pointing accusingly toward the sky, her movements slow and deliberate. I froze, unable to move, as she began to chant in a language I couldn't understand. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. The shadows converged, enveloping me in a cocoon of darkness and fear. Desperate to escape, I turned and ran, sprinting back toward my truck with every ounce of strength I could muster. The laughter and chanting followed, the sounds growing louder, more intense, until they felt like a physical force pushing against me. My legs burned, my lungs heaving with each breath. But I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my truck. I slammed the door shut, slamming the latch and sealing myself inside. The engine roared to life as I sped away, the road a blur beneath me. The sounds faded gradually, replaced by the relentless hum of the truck's engine and the rhythmic thump of my heart. I didn't stop until I was well past Dead Man's Pass, the stretch of road that had become a place of nightmares. The memory of that night haunted me, the images of the woman in white and the echoing laughter etched into my mind. I never spoke of it to anyone, afraid they wouldn't believe me or worse, thinking I was losing my grip on reality. But the locals knew. Over the years, I heard whispers and stories from fellow truckers about the cursed stretch of road and the ghostly apparitions that plagued those who dared to traverse it at night. They spoke of a woman who had died in a tragic accident on that very pass, her spirit forever trapped in a loop of fear and sorrow, seeking vengeance on those who disturbed her peace. I never drove through that area again, the memory of that night serving as a constant reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. The desert, with all its beauty and solitude, also held secrets that were best left undisturbed, shadows that lurked just beyond the reach of the headlights, waiting to claim their next victim. Years have passed since that harrowing night, but the experience left an indelible mark on me. I've driven countless miles through desolate highways and across barren landscapes, but nothing compares to the terror I felt under the dark skies of Dead Man's Pass. The laughter, the footsteps, the apparition of the woman in white, they linger in my mind, haunting me like a ghost that refuses to let go. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the road stretches endlessly before me and the darkness seems almost tangible, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing there, waiting. The memory of her hollow eyes and the weight of her silent scream is a chilling reminder that some places hold onto their secrets, guarding them against the intrusion of the living. If you ever find yourself driving alone through the Nevada desert at night, and you hear the faint sound of children's laughter echoing from the back seat of your truck, heed my warning. Don't stop. Don't look back. Because some spirits aren't content to linger in the shadows. They're waiting to pull you into their eternal, haunted existence. Remember my story, and let it serve as a cautionary tale. The desert is beautiful, but it's also unforgiving. A place where the lines between the living and the dead blur beneath the endless canopy of stars. And in those moments when the night feels too quiet, too still, know that you're never truly alone. Story number 5. The Vanishing Tale. Driving through the vast expanse of Texas highways has always been a part of who I am. As a long-haul trucker, the road is my constant companion, my lifeline to the world outside the cab. But some stretches of asphalt hold secrets that remain buried beneath layers of asphalt and time. Secrets that whisper warnings to those who dare to traverse them late at night. It was late October 2010, and I was hauling a load of construction materials from Dallas to Amarillo. The nights were getting colder, the days shorter, but I was accustomed to the rhythm of the road. My rig was a reliable beast, its engine purring smoothly as I navigated the winding roads of West Texas. The radio played old country tunes, their familiar melodies a comfort against the solitude of the night. Around midnight, I entered a stretch of highway that locals rarely spoke about, the one that sliced through the heart of the West Texas wilderness, where the lights of civilization faded into distant memories and the darkness seemed almost palpable. The road here was narrow, flanked by towering mesquite trees that cast long, eerie shadows in the truck's headlights. That's when I saw it, a sedan. One of those older models that seemed out of place amidst the dominance of trucks and SUVs on these roads. It was following me, tailing at a distance just close enough for me to notice but not close enough to feel threatened. I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching sight of it flicker into view as if it was there one moment and gone the next. First, I dismissed it as a fellow trucker or a lost traveler seeking a ride. But as the miles ticked by, the sedan remained steadfast, its presence a silent, unnerving companion in the vast emptiness. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the road ahead, the hum of the engine, the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. Yet, the sedan persisted, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone on this desolate stretch. An hour into the journey, as I approached the junction pass, a notorious bend known for its treacherous curves and limited visibility, the sedan vanished. One moment it was mirroring my every move, and the next, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness without a trace. No brake marks, no sudden appearance in the distance, just an empty road stretching before me. Shaken, I continued driving, but the unease lingered. The road felt different now, the air heavier, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches clawing at the sky, creating a canopy that felt oppressive rather than protective. The night pressed in, the silence deepening, broken only by the steady rhythm of my tires on the asphalt. As I climbed the final stretch of the pass, the road narrowed even further, the pavement rougher under the weight of my truck. The headlights struggled to pierce the darkness, casting long, wavering shadows that danced alongside me. That's when the knocking started. First, it was subtle, a faint tapping sound that I attributed to loose gravel or perhaps an animal scurrying nearby. But the knocking grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the cabin like the relentless beat of a drum. I froze, heart pounding, as the sound seemed to emanate from the roof of the truck. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the sedan reappear. But there was nothing, just the endless night stretching out behind me. The knocking continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention, desperate to communicate. Panic set in as I realized the sound wasn't coming from the roof. It felt more internal, like a presence within the cabin itself, pressing against my mind and my senses. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady myself against the mounting fear. The knocking felt like a message, a warning, but the meaning was lost in the chaos of my racing thoughts. Desperate to escape the unnerving atmosphere, I decided to pull over at the next exit, a small, abandoned rest stop that seemed forgotten by time. The sign was faded, barely legible, and the area was eerily quiet. The only sound the distant howl of a lone coyote. I parked the truck and stepped out, the cold night air biting at my skin, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and earth. As I approached the rest stop, the knocking ceased abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on me. I walked around the truck, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the sedan. But there was nothing, no car, no footprints, no indication that anyone had been there recently. That's when I saw the shadows. They were different from anything I'd seen before, dark, elongated shapes that seemed to writhe and twist in the corners of my vision. The trees around the rest stop appeared to move, their branches contorting into grotesque forms that reached out like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, the night darker, as if the rest stop had become a gateway to another realm, one where the rules of reality no longer applied. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I wasn't alone. The shadows began to coalesce, forming vague, humanoid figures that moved with unnatural grace. their presence oppressive and malevolent. My breath quickened, the fear gripping me with an iron fist as I backed away, desperate to return to the safety of my truck. But the shadows advanced, their movements silent and deliberate. I turned to run, my legs moving on autopilot, but the darkness seemed to stretch out before me. The road back to the truck obscured by the encroaching night. The feeling of being watched intensified, a presence pressing in from all sides, suffocating me with its unseen weight. In a last-ditch effort to escape, I sprinted back to the truck, my heart pounding in my chest, the shadows closing in behind me. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking as I tried to unlock the door, but the shadows reached out, their cold fingers brushing against my skin, freezing me in place. My mind screamed for me to fight, to run, but my body refused to obey, paralyzed by the sheer terror of the moment. The knocking returned, louder and more frenzied, echoing through the cabin like a heartbeat gone mad. I could feel the presence surrounding me, pressing in from all angles, a relentless force that sought to claim me. Desperation clawed at my mind as I forced myself to move, to fight against the invisible grip that held me captive. With a surge of adrenaline, I managed to start the truck, the engine roaring to life as I slammed the door shut, shutting out the darkness and the shadows that sought to enter. I gunned the engine, the truck lurching forward as I sped away from the rest stop, the road ahead stretching endlessly into the night. The knocking faded as I drove, the shadows dissolving into the darkness behind me, leaving only the oppressive silence of the highway. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the first hints of dawn breaking on the horizon, casting a pale light on the road that now seemed like a sanctuary from the horrors of the night. But the memory lingered, a haunting reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, a presence that had followed me from the rest stop and remained tethered to my very soul. The story of the sedan that vanished without a trace became something more, a legend, a warning to those who dared to traverse that lonely stretch of road. In the years since that night, I've heard other stories from fellow truckers, tales of ghostly sedans that appear out of nowhere, drivers who feel an invisible force pressing against them, trying to communicate from beyond. Some say it's the spirit of a driver who lost his way, forever trapped on the roads he loved so dearly. Others believe it's something darker, a malevolent entity that feeds on fear and isolation. But no matter the explanation, one thing is certain: some roads aren't just pathways through the wilderness. They're conduits to places better left unexplored, realms where the dead walk and the living are left to wonder if they were ever truly alone. So, if you ever find yourself driving through West Texas at night, and you see an old sedan tailing you through the darkness, remember my story. Don't engage. Don't look back. Because some shadows are more than just figments of your imagination. They're echoes of the past, waiting to pull you into their eternal, haunting chase. Story number 6. The Shadow on the Pass. The Colorado Rockies have a way of both mesmerizing and terrifying you. In 2003, I learned that lesson the hard way, under a sky so dark it seemed to swallow light whole. I was hauling freight through one of those desolate mountain passes, the kind that stretch infinitely, where the world feels both vast and claustrophobic at the same time. It was just past midnight, and the moon was a thin crescent, its light barely piercing the inky blackness of the night. My rig was loaded with timber bound for Denver, the engine humming steadily as I navigated the winding road that cut through the heart of the mountains. The solitude was comforting, a rare peace that only the open road could provide. But that peace was about to be shattered. As I climbed the final stretch of the pass, the air grew colder, the wind picking up in a way that suggested an approaching storm. The road was barely visible, lit only by the distant headlights of my own truck. The towering pines around me stood like silent sentinels, their shadows dancing in the fleeting light. Then I saw her. A figure stood at the crest of the pass, her outline barely distinguishable against the rocky backdrop. She was tall, clad in a flowing white dress that fluttered eerily in the gusts. Her hair was long and dark, cascading down her back in wild waves. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold, deep, hollow, and devoid of any warmth. They stared down at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding as I forced the truck to a halt. The engine roared to a halt, and I sat there, frozen, staring at the woman who seemed more specter than human. For a moment, she just stood there, unblinking, watching me. Then, without a word, she turned and began to walk away, her movements slow and deliberate. My mind raced. Ghost stories? Just the isolation and the cold playing tricks on me? I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease that had settled in my gut. But just as I was about to turn back onto the road, I heard it, a loud, persistent knocking coming from the roof of a nearby cabin. The cabin was just a short distance off the main road, an old, weathered structure that looked abandoned. The knocking was frantic, desperate, echoing through the still night air. I felt a pull, an inexplicable urge to investigate. Against my better judgment, I pulled the truck over and stepped out, my boots crunching on the snow-covered ground. The knocking continued, relentless. I approached the cabin, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the darkness as I made my way to the front door. My heart raced, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the cabin, the knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that felt almost tangible. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the moonlight filtering through the broken windows. Dust motes floated in the air, and the remnants of a fire long extinguished littered the room. Ash, cracked glass, and charred remnants of what had once been a cozy hearth. I glanced around, searching for any sign of life, but there was nothing. No one, no movement, nothing to explain the knocking. My eyes then caught sight of a message scrawled across the wall in what looked like soot. "I am here." A chill ran down my spine as I took in the words. The message clear yet inexplicable. My rational mind tried to piece it together, some prankster, a ventriloquist act, something, anything. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something sinister. I turned to leave, but then I saw it, the footprints. They were unlike any footprints I'd ever seen, large, distorted, leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the forest. They were fresh, and there was no sign of where they had originated from. Panic surged through me as I realized that the woman on the pass and these footprints were connected in some way. I started back to my truck, my mind reeling with fear and confusion. As I climbed into the cab, the temperature seemed to drop even further, my breath visible in the cold air. I turned on the engine, but the truck wouldn't start. I tried again, frustration mounting, but the engine remained silent. That's when I heard it again, the knocking, louder this time, echoing from above. I looked up, heart hammering, and saw the same woman from the past standing at the edge of the cabin. Her eyes still fixed on me. She raised a hand, pointing upward. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. She was pointing at the roof. I glanced back at the cabin, and there, atop the roof, was something else entirely. A door, a small, wooden door that hadn't been there before, stood ajar, and on the roof, illuminated by the moonlight, was a pair of hands, pale, skeletal hands that reached out toward the cabin, beckoning me closer. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away, until one of the hands began to move, tapping insistently on the roof. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed up, trying to get a closer look. Each step was a battle against the icy grip of fear that held me in place. When I reached the top, I found the door. It was old, the wood weathered and brittle, and the hinges squeaked as I pushed it open. Inside was a small, empty room, the same room that had been in the cabin earlier. The clock on the wall was missing, leaving a gaping hole where it had once hung. But the message was still there, now even more pronounced. "I am here." A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing my flashlight and plunging me into darkness. I heard the whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from all around me, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. The hands began to move again, this time covering the window, their fingers clawing at the glass as if trying to get out. I stumbled back, slipping on the icy surface, and fell to the ground. As I looked up, the woman stood before me, her eyes empty, her presence overwhelming. I felt a force, an invisible grip pulling me toward her, and I struggled, desperate to break free. Just as suddenly as it had started, the scene changed. I was back in the truck, the engine roaring to life and the cold lifting from the air. The knocking had ceased, and the footprints were gone, leaving only the memory of that night to haunt me. I didn't stay long. I sped down the mountain pass, not daring to look in the rearview mirror, my mind racing with the impossibility of what I'd experienced. I reached the next town by dawn, exhausted and shaken, and never looked back. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. Some say it was a ghost, a restless spirit tied to the land, while others believe it was something darker, something that feeds on fear and solitude. I know what I saw, and I know that some roads are best left untraveled, some mountains left untouched by human feet. If you ever find yourself driving alone on a desolate highway, and you see a figure standing by the roadside, remember my story. Don't stop, don't look back, because some shadows aren't just figments of your imagination. There's something far more real, far more dangerous. Story number 7. The woman on the highway. The roads out here are a lifeline, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Montana. As a long-haul trucker, I've driven them countless times, navigating through fog, snow, and the eerie stillness that only comes with the dead of night. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that fateful night in October 1995. I was hauling a load of lumber from Billings to Missoula, a routine run that usually meant solitude and endless stretches of road illuminated by the unforgiving glare of my headlights. The night was colder than usual, the air crisp with the scent of impending winter. My truck was my home for the next 18 hours, a metal cocoon that kept the harsh elements at bay. It was around 2 a.m. when I first saw her, a lone figure standing by the roadside, her white dress billowing gently in the wind. At first, I thought she was just another traveler, someone who had strayed from the main path or perhaps lost their way. Her presence was unsettling, though, a stark contrast against the dark expanse of the highway. I slowed down, the engine humming quietly as I approached. She looked up, her face partially obscured by long, dark hair that fell in waves over her shoulders. Her eyes were fixed on me, hollow and searching, as if she was waiting for something or someone. Pulling over, I rolled down the window, the cold night air rushing into the cab. "Need a ride somewhere?" I called out, my voice betraying a hint of caution. She didn't respond. Instead, she reached out her hand, palm open, an unspoken plea for help. There was no fear in her stance, only a desperate hope that tugged at something deep within me. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and motioned for her to climb in. As she settled into the back seat, the temperature inside the truck seemed to drop. I could feel the chill emanating from her presence, a stark contrast to the warm interior I'd grown accustomed to. She sat there silently, her eyes never leaving mine through the rearview mirror. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires were the only sounds in the cabin. I tried to make small talk, asking her where she was headed, but she remained silent, her gaze distant and unfocused. It was then that I noticed something strange. Her reflection in the mirror was blurred, as if she was fading into the darkness. I glanced back, expecting to see her solid presence, but she was gone. My heart raced as I looked around, searching the cab for any sign of her. "Hello," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Are you okay?" The back seat was empty, the only trace of her presence a lingering chill in the air. I rubbed my eyes, shaking my head in disbelief. Had she really been there? Or was it just a figment of my exhausted mind? I reached for my phone, intending to call it a night and find a safe place to rest. But the device was gone, as if it had never been there. Panic surged through me as I realized I wasn't alone. The headlights cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the road. That's when I saw it. A massive, dark shape moving swiftly through the trees. Too large to be an animal, it seemed to glide over the ground, its presence ominous and foreboding. I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator, the truck lurching forward as I tried to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was pursuing us. The road twisted and turned, disappearing into the thick forest. My mind raced, thoughts jumbling together in a frantic attempt to make sense of the night's events. The radio crackled to life, a static-filled announcement about a missing trucker on the same stretch of highway. My heart sank as I realized I wasn't alone in experiencing something strange out here. I kept driving, the sense of being watched never leaving me. The dark shape seemed to follow, always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows between the trees. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I feared I'd catch a glimpse of her again, the woman in white whose presence had sent shivers down my spine. Hours passed, the first hints of dawn breaking on the horizon. The darkness began to lift, revealing the beauty of the Montana wilderness in the early morning light. Exhausted and shaken, I finally allowed myself to relax, the terror of the night slowly fading as the sun rose. It was then that I decided to pull over at a small rest stop, the promise of civilization a beacon of safety after the harrowing night. As I stepped out of the truck, the cold morning air felt like a balm, soothing my frayed nerves. I stretched my legs, taking in the quiet serenity of the early day. That's when I saw it, a photograph lying on the ground near my truck. Curious, I picked it up, recognizing the scene immediately. It was a picture of my cab, taken just moments before I had left. In the background, barely visible in the soft morning light, was the same cabin I'd rented years later for a winter getaway. Confusion gnawed at me as I flipped through the photo. There was another figure in the picture, someone I didn't recognize, a woman standing by the roadside, just like she had the night I had stopped for her. My pulse quickened as I realized the horrifying truth. The photograph was taken from a perspective I couldn't see, as if someone was watching me all along. I looked up, scanning the rest stop for any sign of another trucker. But the area was deserted. The sense of dread returned, stronger than before. It was then that I heard a whisper, soft and indistinct, carried on the wind. "I am still here." I dropped the photograph, my heart pounding in my chest. The words echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of the night's terror. I knew then that I wasn't just haunted by a fleeting apparition, but by something far more sinister, something that refused to let me go. From that day on, I avoided those stretches of highway, the memory of the woman in white and the haunting whispers a constant reminder of the thin veil between our world and whatever lies beyond. I became more cautious, more aware of the shadows that lingered just out of sight, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to cross their path. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night, whether it was a supernatural encounter or a psychological break fueled by isolation and exhaustion. But one thing is certain. The roads out here hold secrets that are better left untouched. Stories that are meant to stay in the shadows of the dark. Silent wilderness. If you ever find yourself driving alone on a deserted highway, and you see a figure standing by the roadside, remember my story. Don't stop. Don't look back. Because some ghosts aren't content to linger in the past. They're waiting to pull you into their eternal, haunting night.